Hi everyone. Thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. My name is Dr. Evan Hart, and I am an assistant professor of history at Missouri Western State University in the Department of Social Sciences and Humanities. I am presenting today 100 Years of Women's Suffrage, a discussion of the 19th Amendment, in support of Rolling Hills Library's 19th Amendment celebration and programming. I again want to thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to this video, and I also want to thank Anali Matthews for inviting me to present to you all. What I'd like to do today is to cover a little bit of ground about the history of the 19th Amendment, to talk about some of the arguments for women's suffrage from the time period, to talk about some arguments against women's suffrage from the time period, and then to examine the path to suffrage, how we actually end up with the 19th Amendment. I first want to begin by talking about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which is spelled out here for everyone to read, was ratified in 1868 during the period known as Reconstruction, which followed the Civil War. The 14th Amendment made clear who precisely in the United States is a citizen. Indeed, as it says here, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. It says that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. The 14th Amendment, as originally drafted, was intended to ensure that newly freed individuals would be considered citizens by the United States. But the 14th Amendment is also going to reinvigorate debates by and for women in favor of granting women the right to vote. In particular, what the passage or the ratification of the 14th Amendment will lead to is something called the new departure argument. This is an argument that says that women were citizens of the United States, that the 14th Amendment had absolutely clarified that all women who were born in the United States were indeed citizens, and that they had the privileges and immunities of citizenship. And because women are citizens, they need only take hold of their right to vote. It was not something that they needed to wait for. It was something that should already be theirs. That all citizens should have the right to vote, and because women are citizens, they indeed should also have the right to vote. However, the federal government did not take this argument particularly seriously. According to the government, women did not have the right to vote. So while the new departure argument is one that they're developing, it is not necessarily one that is taken particularly seriously by government officials. And so women are going to have to begin developing new arguments. Arguments that say there should be laws or amendments passed explicitly granting women the right to vote. So what I want to do now is kind of turn our focus to thinking about, well, what kinds of arguments do supporters of women's suffrage forward? What kinds of arguments do they use to justify their calls for suffrage for women? When we think about the arguments for women's suffrage, they tend to boil down to two arguments. Arguments for justice and arguments for reform. I want to start with the argument for justice. The idea behind justice arguments was that women were equal to men. And if they were equal to men, they were deserving of equality. That there was no reason for the government not to provide equality and equal rights for women. If women were indeed citizens, as men were citizens, they were thus deserving of the right to vote, an important element of citizenship. Unfortunately, many white suffragists ignored the issue of race, arguing that all other men had been granted the franchise through the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, and thus they argued they could no longer deny the right to vote to women. This, of course, ignores the fact that large numbers of black men who had been granted the right to vote under the 15th Amendment were in reality not able to exercise their right to vote. But women were making an argument, or at least white women were making an argument, that everyone else in the United States had been granted the right to vote. All of their citizens were able to vote, and thus there was no reason to deny the vote to women. They also forwarded a relatively old argument that women are beholden to laws and they must pay taxes. However, they have no voice in those laws and who makes them. If women are citizens and are considered responsible enough for their actions to be punished and to pay taxation, then they must have the right to vote. Essentially, they're going to use the old argument from the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. If women must abide by laws, if they must pay taxes, then they must also have a voice in who gets to create those laws, who gets to tax women's property. The last argument under the justice heading is embodied by this cartoon that I have here above, where it has Uncle Sam moved by public opinion. We have a nurse, which is embodied by what they call American womanhood, with Uncle Sam saying, if you are good enough for war, you are good enough to vote. Even though by World War I, women were not serving formally in the military, which was an argument used by some men to deny women the right to vote, they had been critical in every single war and armed conflict in American history. Their support continued during World War I, with women arguing that they are just as patriotic as men. They supported the war effort, as did men, and thus they should be able to vote just like men. That we do not deny the right to vote to men who are too old to serve in the military or have physical disabilities that mean that they are not welcome to serve in the military. So if that's the case, then why do we deny the right to vote to women simply on the basis of their inability to serve within uniform? What these justice arguments all have in common is the idea that men and women are equal, that men and women are basically the same. And if they are the same, they are deserving of equal rights. But women are not only going to make arguments that justice requires that women are granted the right to vote. The second umbrella argument used by many women was the argument of reform. This argument suggested that women were men's equals in terms of citizenship, but that they're essentially different than men, and thus they are especially deserving of the franchise. The fight for women's rights and the women's right to vote was especially powerful during a period known as the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was a time of reform, trying to reform political corruption, trying to reform the problems within American cities. And what women begin to argue is that women's right to vote would allow them to push through much needed reforms. For example, ending child labor, providing special protections for women, work safety for all workers, and asylum and prison reform. We can see, for example, in this image that we have a typical progressive woman. She's holding in her hand a shovel marked as ballot, and she is quite literally cleaning up the dirty pool of politics, where we have, right in the background, food adulteration, bribery, white slavery, and graft, all dirty elements of politics of the time that women argued if they had the right to vote, they would be able to solve. For Black women, for Black suffragists, this was a particularly powerful argument. For many Black suffragists, the hope was that gaining of the franchise would allow them to begin pushing through racial equality. That this would actually be more powerful for Black women than it would be for white women, since the majority of Black men had been prevented from voting. So if you see in this cartoon, for example, we have an African American mother, and she is beating back with the franchise Jim Crow laws, segregation, the grandfather clause, all elements in American society that were preventing or hindering the progress of Black Americans. And the argument went that just as white women are supposedly viewed as more moral and mother-like, that Black women were also more moral and mother-like. And that if Black women were granted the franchise, that would have an even more dramatic impact on Black communities than white communities, because most Black men, because of things like the grandfather clause, like Jim Crow, like segregation, were unable to exercise their right to vote. Under this reform argument, women are going to begin to argue, this is going to come from both Black and white suffragists, that women are actually more immune to corruption due to the perceived inherent morality of women. The gendered notions of the day suggested that women were more pious, religious, and moral, that they were quite literally closer to God. And if they were quite literally closer to God, then it would hold that the franchise would be even safer in their arms, because they are the more moral sex. That the franchise would actually be safer in women's hands than in men's. They could counter corruption in American cities and begin to heal the various problems that were infecting the world. And they argued they could do that while still caring for their duties at home. So for example, in this image, we see that the lady says she can handle both the ballot box on the left and her home duties on the right. The reform argument also insisted that the vote would save women from the allegedly less dignified approach to politics, including marching, protesting, etc. For example, suffragist Alice Stone Blackwell wrote, quote, "Because it is the quietest, easiest, most dignified, and least conspicuous way of influencing public affairs, I take much less expenditure of time, labor, and personal presence to take up to the ballot box, drop in a slip of paper, and then come away than to persuade a multitude of miscellaneous voters to vote right. That it would give women more power and authority, that women would exercise the vote in a moral fashion, and that this would actually save them from the allegedly more undignified approaches, including protesting and marching. Now, I want to stress that these are not the only arguments that women are making, but they tended to be the most common and the arguments that tended to hold the most weight. That doesn't mean, however, that all Americans were swayed by women's arguments in favor of the franchise. Indeed, there were many counter-arguments to women's suffrage, a few of which I want to discuss here. There were essentially three main arguments, or three main counter-arguments. This, of course, does not cover every single argument, but gives us a sense of the biggest arguments being made. The first was that women were physically and mentally unable to exercise sound judgment. This was basically built on faulty understandings of biology, whereby some were arguing that people have finite energy. If women exerted themselves mentally, then they jeopardized their reproductive health, that they jeopardized their so-called true purpose of bearing and rearing children. For example, William Sedgwick, a biologist, argued, quote, "We must not forget pregnancy and lactation, both of which are a great strain on a mother's vitality. Any further strain, like the responsibilities of the suffrage, is bound to be harmful to both mother and child," end quote. Even women out of childbearing years were considered ineligible because menopause caused, quote, "serious and long-continued mental disorders, developing in connection with the approaching extinction of a woman's reproductive faculty," end quote. And that quote also came from William Sedgwick. While, of course, we know that there is no actual evidence to back up these assertions, the belief was that suffrage would prevent women from exercising their so-called true purpose of bearing children. In addition, many physicians argued that women just weren't smart enough to vote. They insisted that women's brains were smaller and their concerns feminine. So, for example, here I have a mocking cartoon where it says "a woman's mind magnified," where it shows what women are really concerned about: chocolates and marriage and men and fashion, babies and puppies. The idea was that women simply did not have the intellect to understand the issues at hand when voting. That they shouldn't be granted the right to vote because they weren't intelligent enough. They didn't care enough to exercise that franchise responsibly. Another argument was that women voting would undermine the family and traditional family roles. In particular, it insisted that the franchise would emasculate men. The argument meant that woman's place was inside the home and that men are best prepared to exert their power outside the home. According to a Democratic representative from California, J.P. Sanford, quote, "The mother's influence is needed in the home. Let her teach her daughters that modesty, patience, and gentleness are the charms of a woman. Let her teach her sons that an honest conscience is every man's first political law. The mothers of this country can shape the destinies of the nation by keeping in their places and attending to those duties that God Almighty intended for them," end quote. The argument being that woman exerts her influence in politics through her husbands and her sons. that when women vote, they emasculate men. This argument continued that it's man's role, ordained by God and his physical strength, to protect women. Sanford, for example, argued that men should be, quote, manly men, and women should be, quote, womanly women. We can see here in this political cartoon kind of this attitude about emasculation and women becoming more masculine. Lastly, some argued that women wouldn't vote their conscience. That because women were less intelligent than men, because women could be swayed by their husbands, that they would essentially be giving their husbands 2 votes. That they would vote the way that their husband insisted. Despite these negative arguments against women gaining the franchise, we do know that women were eventually able to push through the 19th Amendment. What I want to talk about now is the path to suffrage, how women were able to push through ratification of the 19th Amendment. The first very strong efforts to grant women the constitutional right to vote came when we had the debate over the 15th Amendment, which is called the Universal Male Suffrage Amendment. It was the amendment which granted all men the right to vote. Many white suffragists were very angry about the fact that black men would be given the right to vote before white women. There's going to emerge out of the debates over the 15th Amendment a lot of racist language, a lot of anti-black language, where suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to insist that educated white women should be granted the vote before uneducated black men. However, it became pretty clear pretty swiftly that Congress and the states were not willing to extend the right to vote to women through the 15th Amendment. So what suffragists begin to argue, or what they begin to advocate for, was a separate amendment modeled on the 15th to grant women explicitly the right to vote. The amendment was first proposed in 1878 and would be introduced in every session of Congress for the next 41 years. So what changed? What all of a sudden made possible the reality of pushing through the 19th Amendment? World War I is what really provided the context needed to allow women's suffrage to look like a reality. President Woodrow Wilson's insistence that American involvement came down to a protection of democracy showed him to be a hypocrite as he pushed back against women's calls for suffrage. This is going to lead to picketing of the White House and the arrest and forced feedings of suffragists. We see here, for example, one of the suffragists protesting against President Wilson, calling him Kaiser Wilson, hearkening back to the Kaiser of Germany. We see this image of women also protesting outside the White House with signs saying, "Mr. President, what will you do for woman suffrage?" Wilson was eventually won over by the arguments from suffragists, especially his daughter, suffragist Jessie Woodrow Wilson Sayre. Indeed, in 1918, Wilson, for the first time, endorsed suffrage in a speech before Congress, saying, quote, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? Unfortunately, Congress did not pass the amendment, but he continued voicing his support. The amendment eventually passed through Congress on June 4, 1919, leading to a state-by-state campaign to convince states to ratify. Now, remember, 3/4 of states must agree to ratify for an amendment to become part of the Constitution. Building off of successes in the West, suffragists convinced legislators in the West, the Midwest, and a number of states in the Northeast to ratify. Southern states, however, launched an anti-suffrage campaign to prevent the amendment from being ratified. But by mid-1920, 35 of the 36 required states had ratified. Women needed one more, and only 5 states were willing to even consider voting before the end of the year. 4, Connecticut, Vermont, North Carolina, and Florida, wouldn't consider the resolution. So the battle came down to Tennessee. Both pro and anti-supporters began intense suffrage lobbying. This became nicknamed the War of the Roses, as supporters of women's suffrage wore yellow roses and the anti wore red roses. The youngest member of the State House, Harry T. Burn, pictured here, originally voted to table the amendment, wearing a red rose to the State House. Another representative, however, switched sides from tabling to voting, and the vote went through. The Senate chamber was shocked, however, when Burn voted aye in favor of suffrage. He had worn a red rose and had stated he was not in favor of suffrage. So what changed his mind? He said he was going to vote because it was what his district wanted, but that he received a letter from his mother, Feb E. Burn, in which she asked him to be, quote, a good boy and vote for suffrage. His vote helped seal the amendment's fate in Tennessee. Tennessee's ratification documents arrived in Washington on August 26, 1920, and the amendment was quietly signed by the Secretary of State, making it an official amendment to the Constitution. Thank you.